The fire was already out when Eleanor Marsh burned the last thing she owned that carried his name. Not his photograph. She had returned that to his sister 2 weeks after the funeral, wrapped in brown paper, tied with kitchen twine. No note inside because there was nothing she could say that would have been both true and kind. Not his books. Those had gone to the church. Not his clothes, his pocket watch, the pair of cufflinks he wore every Sunday to prove to the congregation that he was the kind of man who owned cufflinks. What she burned was a letter. Her own letter, written 4 months before he died, addressed to him, never sent. 5 years of trying to explain herself to a man who had already decided she required no explanation because she required no attention at all. She had written it in one sitting at the kitchen table, 2 in the morning, the house quiet around her, the way a house is quiet when the person you share it with has made you invisible. She had read it once, folded it, kept it in the lining of her winter coat, like something she was saving for a moment that never arrived. Thomas Marsh died in April of 1882. A fever that took him in 11 days. Eleanor sat by his bed. She held his hand when the doctor said to hold his hand. She watched his breathing slow, and then stop. And then she sat there another hour in the chair because she was not certain what a widow was supposed to do next. And she had spent 5 years being uncertain about what she was supposed to do next. And this felt like more of the same. She did not cry. Not at the bedside. Not at the funeral, where 40 people told her what a good man Thomas had been, and she nodded because they were not wrong. He had been good in all the ways that showed. He had simply been entirely absent in all the ways that mattered. She had lived inside his house, eaten at his table, slept beside him in his bed, and for 5 years she had been as invisible to him as rain on a window. Present. Unremarkable. Something to look through on the way to seeing something else. It was 2 weeks after the funeral, sitting in the parlor with his sister going through his papers, that Eleanor found the letter still folded in the lining of her coat. She burned it that night in the kitchen stove, alone, the rest of the house dark. She watched the paper curl and blacken. She watched the ink she had chosen so carefully, the words she had pressed so hard into the page, disappear into ash. She felt nothing, and that frightened her more than grief would have. The next morning, she opened the Columbus Dispatch to the classified section and read an advertisement she had already read 3 times that week, had already folded the page around, had already told herself she was not seriously considering. One line had been underlined in pencil, her own hand. Not needed. Sentiment. She looked at those 3 words for a long time. Then she wrote a letter to Copper Creek, Montana, that was careful and factual and contained nothing she was not prepared to stand behind. She received a reply in 9 days. Even shorter than her letter, functional, almost cold. She booked passage on the westbound train 2 weeks later. The valise she carried onto the platform at Columbus Union Station contained one good dress, one everyday dress, the calico she kept for Sundays, 3 changes of underclothing, her mother's Bible, a small bottle of camphor liniment, and a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed cord. The bundle was not letters. It was not personal papers. She had not looked at it since the night she left the law office of Harrington and Sons 6 years prior, on the last day she worked there before her engagement to Thomas Marsh made such employment improper for a woman of her new station. She did not know, precisely, why she had kept the documents. She had told herself, at the time, that it was simply the habit of a woman trained to file things correctly, to preserve records that mattered. She had told herself this often enough that she had almost come to believe it. She stored the valise in the overhead rack and sat down and looked out the window as Ohio pulled away behind her. She did not look back. The train took 4 days. She changed lines twice, slept sitting up, ate what the dining car offered without tasting it. She watched the landscape change outside the window in the way that landscape does when you travel far enough west, the flat, familiar green of Ohio giving way to the roll of Indiana, then the wide prairies of Illinois and Iowa, where the sky became something different altogether, something that had room in it, room that the sky back home had never quite offered. By the time the Rockies appeared on the horizon, she had stopped trying to catalog what she was leaving and started, cautiously, reluctantly, simply looking at what was ahead. She arrived at Copper Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The stagecoach from the rail junction deposited her in front of a building that was part post office, part general store, and part waiting room for people with nowhere better to wait. The air was different here. Thinner, colder at the edges, even in the afternoon sun. It smelled of pine resin and horse and something she would later come to identify as the particular quality of Montana sky before weather. She stepped down from the coach with her valise and stood on the wooden boards of the platform and looked around. There was a man leaning against a post near the edge of the building, not waiting inside, not waiting near the door. Leaning against the far post, back to the wall, as though he had placed himself at the outermost acceptable distance from the arrival itself, and was prepared to stay there until the situation resolved itself one way or another. She recognized him not from the photograph he had sent, which was old and blurred and told her almost nothing except that he had once been willing to sit still long enough for someone to photograph him. She recognized him from the way he was standing, the way a person stands when they have already decided something but are waiting to see if the decision will hold. She did not smile. He did not smile. She picked up her valise and walked toward him because someone had to move first, and she had not traveled 1,400 miles to wait for someone else to make the first step. His name was Caleb Holt. He was 38 years old. He was taller than she had estimated from the photograph, broader across the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that comes not from age alone, but from years of looking at a horizon that does not offer much shelter from the wind. His right shoulder, she noticed, sat slightly lower than his left. A small thing. The kind of thing most people would not notice. She noticed. He took her valise without asking. She did not thank him. They walked to the horses. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours. He did not speak. She did not speak. She watched the landscape, and she watched, from the corner of her eye, the way he held himself in the saddle, the slight shift of weight to the left when the trail steepened, the way his right arm moved less freely than his left. Old pain. Something that had been there long enough to become ordinary, long enough that he no longer noticed he was compensating for it. She noticed. The cabin appeared as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. Weathered logs, a roof that needed attention in 2 places she could identify from a distance, a chimney with smoke staining the stones above the line, one window catching the last orange light of the day. No garden, no curtains, no evidence from the outside that any consideration had been given to comfort beyond the functional minimum required to survive a Montana winter. He swung down, tied the horses, lifted her valise, and carried it inside without looking at her. She followed. 1 room. A cast iron stove in the corner that had gone cold. A table with 2 chairs. Shelves lined with tins and jars and tools. everything arranged with a precision that was less about order and more about control. The precision of a man who had lived alone long enough that the arrangement of objects had become a form of conversation with himself, a way of marking each day as a day that had been managed. There was a narrow door to the left of the stove. He pointed at it. He said her room was through there. He said he slept in the loft. He said she would handle the cooking and the house. He said he would handle everything outside. He said they did not need to discuss what had come before either of them. Then he crouched at the stove and began building a fire. She stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then she opened her valise. The tablecloth was at the top, the way she had packed it, the way she had folded it, the same way her mother had folded it, and her mother before that. White linen, embroidered with yellow daisies along the border, the edges worn soft from years of washing. Her mother had stitched those daisies in the evenings, by lamplight, in the kitchen of a house that was gone now, in a life that was gone now, her fingers moving through the fabric with the ease of someone who has done something so many times that the hands remember what the mind no longer has to direct. Eleanor spread the cloth across the rough pine table. She heard the sound at the stove stop, not a settling of kindling, a pause. The kind of pause that comes when a person sees something they were not prepared to see, and takes a moment to decide how to respond to it. She did not look at him. She smoothed the edges of the cloth with her palms and arranged it so the daisies fell evenly along both long sides. When she finally looked up, he was facing the stove again, but the set of his shoulders was different. Something in the line of his back that had not been there a moment before. She could not have named it precisely. She simply noted it the way she noted everything, quietly, without comment, storing it in the same careful part of her mind that had spent 6 years filing documents that mattered. Supper was beans and hard bread. They ate facing each other. The tablecloth lay between them like a question that neither of them had been asked to answer yet. He finished first. He rinsed his plate at the bucket by the door. He climbed the ladder to the loft without speaking. She sat alone at the table. The fire was going now, casting uneven light across the walls. Outside, wind pressed against the single window, not hard enough to rattle the glass, just enough to remind her where she was. She took paper and ink from her valise and wrote a letter to her sister in Dayton, Ohio. Her handwriting was even, each letter formed with the deliberate care of someone trained to precision, someone who had spent years producing documents that could not afford the ambiguity of poor penmanship. She wrote that she had arrived. She wrote that the country was larger than she had expected. She wrote that the cabin was sound and the man was quiet, and that she was well. She did not write that she was also something else, something she did not quite have a word for yet. Not afraid. Not uncertain, exactly. Something more like a person standing at the edge of a thing, looking down, trying to determine the depth. From the loft above, no sound. And then, after a long while, the sound of someone shifting on a narrow cot. Settling. Going still. She kept writing. She did not know he was watching. There was a gap in the floorboards above, small, the kind of thing that appears in old construction when the wood dries and contracts over years. From certain angles in the loft, in the low light of an oil lamp below, you could see through it. Not well. Enough. He lay still above her and watched the movement of her hand across the page. Even from that distance, through that poor angle, the precision of it was unmistakable. That was not a woman who had learned to write in a schoolroom and practiced occasionally since. That was a hand trained to documents, to legal weight, to language that had to hold. He had placed the advertisement without expecting much. He had placed it because the winter before had been harder than usual, and harder than usual, up here, meant something specific and unforgiving. He had placed it because the practical arguments for a second person on this land had become, by February of that year, impossible to honestly dismiss. He had not placed it because he wanted company. He watched her hand move. He watched the even, unhurried strokes of a woman who was not writing a casual letter. She was writing the way a person writes when writing is a form of holding themselves together. He understood that, at least. He turned over on the cot and looked at the ceiling instead. He lay there until the light below went out, and the cabin went quiet. He did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, she was up before he came down. The stove was lit. Coffee was made. She was at the table with a second cup already waiting beside the first, steam rising from both. He came down the ladder and sat. He did not say anything. He drank the coffee. He ate what she had made, which was better than what he had been making for himself, which was not a high bar, but cleared it. She sat across from him, the tablecloth between them. Neither of them spoke. When he stood to go out, she said she would need to know where things were kept. The extra lamp oil, the flour barrel, the tools she might need for the house. He told her, briefly, without elaboration. She nodded once and began clearing the table. He went outside. She spent the morning learning the cabin methodically, without drawing attention to the process. She found the lamp oil on the second shelf, behind a tin of coffee. She found the flour barrel in the lean-to off the back, along with a sack of cornmeal beginning to go stale at the edges. She found 2 lanterns, one with a cracked chimney. She found a broom behind the door, a mop that had not been used in some time, a washboard leaning against the wall of the lean-to with a crack along the lower frame that made it functional but not efficient. She found, tucked behind the lower shelf near the ladder, pushed back into the shadow where the ladder met the wall, a wooden box, no bigger than a bread loaf. Plain pine, darkened with handling over years. No lock, no marking. She did not touch it. She noted its position, the way the dust had settled around it, but not on the lid, which meant it had been moved recently, or was moved occasionally, touched without being opened or opened and replaced in exactly the same orientation. She noted the way the shadow fell across it. She moved on. She swept the cabin. She mended the crack in the washboard frame with a strip of tin and 2 small nails she found in a jar on the work shelf. She reorganized the kitchen shelf so the most frequently used items were at arm's reach without requiring her to kneel or stretch, a small adjustment that she made without comment and without drawing a map to the logic behind it. In the afternoon, she walked the property, not far. The perimeter she could see from the cabin and a short distance beyond, enough to understand the land's basic character. The fence line to the west needed 2 posts reset before the ground froze hard. The wood pile behind the cabin was adequate in volume, but stacked without order, the heaviest rounds scattered at random heights that would require lifting or bending in ways that were inefficient for a person working alone. She walked the full western perimeter to where the fencing turned north, and there, pressed into the mud near the base of the second post from the corner, she found hoof prints. 2 horses, standing, not moving through, standing and facing the cabin. The prints were fresh enough that the edges had not collapsed, maybe 2 days old, maybe 3. Not a neighbor passing through. A neighbor passing through would not stop and face a man's cabin and then leave without announcing themselves. She stood there in the afternoon light and looked toward where the prints led back toward the road, toward town. She looked at the post beside her. Someone had tied a horse here recently. The bark was rubbed smooth at chest height in a way that meant a rope, not a casual lean. She ran her finger across the smooth place in the bark, said nothing to the empty land around her. When Caleb came in at dusk, she was making supper. She did not mention the hoof prints. She was not ready, because mentioning them would require a conversation she did not yet have the full shape of, and she had learned, in 6 years of handling documents that decided whether people kept or lost the things they had built, that you did not open an argument before you understood all of what the argument contained. After supper, when he had climbed to the loft and the cabin had settled into its nighttime quiet, Eleanor went to the shelf near the door where the mail was kept, under a coffee tin that served as a paperweight. She had noticed it that morning. A single envelope, thick, sealed, unopened. She touched it now, lifting it carefully, turning it over. The envelope was thick, sealed with red wax pressed with the Northern Pacific Railroad stamp, the company's own mark, not a government seal. That distinction mattered. She knew the difference between a corporation's wax and a federal office's administrative stamp, and she had been trained to know it for exactly the reason that most people did not. The sender's line read, H. Crane, Territorial Representative, Helena, Montana. She stood with the envelope in her hands for a long moment. She knew that name. She had spent 6 years at Harrington & Sons in Columbus, Ohio, handling land claims and contract disputes and railroad negotiations, and she had seen Harlan Crane's name on documents enough times to know what it meant when it appeared. She knew what kind of business brought a man like Crane to the door of a man like Caleb Holt. She knew what kind of offer the envelope contained, and she knew from experience that had cost 4 different families their land between 1875 and 1880, what happened when that offer was refused, and what happened when it was not refused fast enough. She set the envelope back precisely where she had found it. She set the coffee tin on top of it at the same angle, with the same small gap on the left side. She sat back down at the table. She looked at the tablecloth. The yellow daisies her mother had stitched by lamplight in another life. She thought about the bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her valise. She thought about why she had kept them. She thought about whether she had known, when she answered this man's advertisement, that she was walking into something she already had the tools to address, or whether that was simply a story she was telling herself now to make sense of a decision that had really been made in a kitchen at 2 a.m. while she watched a letter burn. She did not have an answer. Not yet. She banked the fire, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. Above her, from the loft, no sound. The cabin settled around her, the logs contracting slightly in the cold, the stove ticking as it cooled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines at the base of the ridge, a low, continuous sound, like something breathing at a great distance. She lay in the dark and she did not feel afraid. She felt, instead, something she had not felt in a long time. She felt like herself, not the self that had lived in Thomas Marsh's house for 5 years, growing quieter each year as though quietness were a thing that could be learned gradually enough that you would not notice when it had become silence. The other self, the one who had noticed things and written them down and filed them carefully because precision mattered and evidence mattered, and the difference between a document that held and one that fell apart under scrutiny was the difference between a family keeping their home and losing it to people who understood that most people did not know how to read the fine print. She thought about the hoof prints at the western fence. She thought about the envelope under the coffee tin. She thought about the wooden box in the shadow at the base of the ladder. The dust settled around it, but not on the lid. There were things in this cabin that needed tending. More than the stove, more than the floor that wanted sweeping, more than the washboard with the cracked frame. She was beginning to understand the shape of what she had walked into. Not fully. Enough. Tomorrow she would make coffee before he came down. She would have it ready. She would watch the way he moved, and she would note what she saw, and she would not say anything before she knew what she was saying. That was how it started. Not with promises, not with declarations, with attention. With a woman who had been trained to read things carefully, deciding that this was worth reading carefully. She closed her eyes. The wind moved through the pines. She slept. She learned him the way she had always learned things that mattered. Not by asking, by watching. 2 weeks passed in the rhythm of the ranch, and in those 2 weeks, Eleanor Marsh learned more about Caleb Holt than she suspected he had told anyone in the previous 12 years. Not because he offered anything, but because he could not entirely help what he revealed through the simple mechanics of existing in a shared space. A person who has lived alone long enough stops editing themselves in the small ways, stops noticing the habits that have calcified into necessity, stops seeing what a second pair of eyes sees without effort. He hung his coat on the left peg every evening, never the right. The right peg was there, identical, 3 inches away, but his hand went to the left without looking. The way a hand goes to something it has reached for so many times that the reaching has become a kind of memory stored in the muscle rather than the mind. He checked the door latch twice before sitting down to eat. Not once, not a cursory glance. Twice with his full attention, running his thumb across the iron catch both times as though confirming something he already knew but needed to confirm anyway. She watched this every evening for 2 weeks without mentioning it, and she understood it in the way she understood most things about this man, as something that had once had a reason and had outlasted the reason and was now simply part of the architecture of how he moved through a day. His hands were never still unless he was sleeping, and she suspected even then. At the table, he reached for things to hold, the edge of the cup, the handle of a fork after he had set it down, the corner of the table itself. In the evenings by the fire, he carved or mended or sharpened whatever needed sharpening, his hands moving through the familiar motions of work the way some people moved through prayer, automatically, continuously, as though stillness were a condition he could not entirely trust. She learned when to speak, which was rarely, and when silence was the more useful offering, which was most of the time. She learned that he took his first cup of coffee standing at the window, looking out toward the eastern ridge where the light came first, and that he did not sit until the coffee was half finished. She learned that he ate everything she put in front of him without comment, which told her less about his opinion of her cooking, and more about the fact that he had been eating whatever he prepared for himself for so long that the concept of food having qualities worth remarking on had simply stopped occurring to him. And she learned one thing that she did not expect to learn, which she discovered by accident on the 4th day and confirmed deliberately on the 8th. He did not eat until she sat down. She had not been paying attention the 4th day, had been slower than usual at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal that was long past needing to be stirred, her mind on the bundle of documents in her valise and the envelope under the coffee tin, and what the intersection of those two things might mean for the man sitting at the table behind her. When she finally turned around, his plate was full, his fork was in his hand, and he had not touched a single bite. He picked up the fork when she pulled out her chair. He began eating when she sat down. On the 8th day, she tested it. She stayed at the stove longer than any reasonable task required, reorganizing a shelf that did not need reorganizing. Her back to the table, waiting. He sat. He waited. 3 minutes passed, which is a long time to wait in silence for a meal you are hungry for after a full morning of physical labor. When she finally crossed to the table and sat, he lifted his fork and ate without any acknowledgement of what had just happened. No comment. No pointed look. As though the waiting were simply what a person did, so obvious it required no explanation. She did not mention it. She let it settle into the same quiet inventory she kept of things that told the truth about a person without meaning to. The first real snow came in the first week of November. She watched it through the window all morning, the flakes falling steady and soft, covering the ground in a layer that muffled sound and transformed the landscape into something that looked almost peaceful. By noon, the peaceful quality had given way to something more serious. By mid-afternoon, the wind had shifted and the flakes were coming sideways, hard and small, driven horizontal across the open ground between the cabin and the woodshed, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made itself known not as discomfort, but as instruction. Caleb had left at dawn for the western fence line. The posts near the corner had been working loose since before she arrived. She had seen that herself on her first afternoon walk, and a storm like this one would test them. He had taken tools and said he would be back by mid-afternoon. Mid-afternoon came and went. She kept the fire burning. She swept the floor, which did not need sweeping. She ground coffee beans in the hand mill, the crank squeaking with each rotation, the smell of it filling the cabin in the way that coffee smells in a cold room, which is to say, it smelled like the most necessary thing in the world. She mended a tear in the hem of her everyday dress, her needle moving through the fabric with the even rhythm she had developed over years, the rhythm that meant her hands were occupied and her mind was working on something else entirely. The clock on the shelf showed 5, then 6, then 1/2 past. The wind screamed against the walls with a sound that made the cabin feel smaller and the world outside feel very large. Eleanor stood at the window and saw nothing but white. The snow was coming so thick it had erased everything beyond the edge of the porch, the woodshed, the fence, the trail, the ridge, the sky itself, all of it replaced by a moving whiteness that had no depth or distance in it. She thought about the western trail, the section where it narrowed near the rocky outcrop, where a man on foot would have to press close to the stone face to keep his footing. She thought about the cold, and what the cold did to a person who was in it too long. And she thought about the shoulder that was already compromised, the arm that moved less freely in the cold. And she thought about these things with the particular quality of attention she gave to situations that had not yet become emergencies but were developing in that direction at a pace that warranted serious consideration. She put another log on the fire. She reheated the coffee. At 7 o'clock the door opened. He came in on a gust of wind and snow that swept across the floor before he could push the door shut against it. His shoulders were white, his beard crusted with ice, his face the deep red of a man who had been in serious cold for a serious amount of time. He stood in the doorway for a moment, breathing hard. the way a person breathes when they have been pushing their body beyond what the body wanted to offer. And then he got the door shut and stood in the sudden relative warmth of the cabin. She did not say she was glad he was back. She did not say she had been worried, which would have been both true and unwelcome. She said in a voice that came out steadier than she expected that she had not been sleeping anyway. He pulled off his gloves. His fingers were stiff, red at the knuckles, slow to bend. He looked at the stove, at the coffee pot sitting on it with steam still rising from the spout, and something crossed his face that was not quite readable, but was not nothing. She saw it then, as he moved toward the stove. The hitch in his right step, more pronounced than usual, the way his right shoulder dropped lower with each stride. He was hurting. Had been hurting, she suspected, since before noon. She poured hot water into a tin cup, added coffee grounds, the ones she had already ground and had waiting, pressed and strained through the cloth she used for the purpose. She held the cup out. He took it. His fingers brushed hers in the transaction, and both of them went still briefly, the cup warm between their hands. She had kept the coffee ready 3 times. The first time because it was practical. The second time because practicality had become something else, quieter and less nameable, the kind of thing a person does not examine too closely while they are doing it. He drank the coffee. He looked at her over the rim of the cup with eyes that were dark and tired, and, for the first time since she had arrived, not entirely closed. He said the coffee was good. She said it had been on the stove a while. He said he knew. The wind howled outside. Inside, the fire crackled, and he sat down at the table, and she brought the stew she had kept warm, ladled it into a bowl, set it in front of him, made her own plate, and sat across. The tablecloth lay between them as it had every evening, the yellow daisies soft in the firelight. They ate in silence, but it was different from the silences that had come before. The earlier silences had been careful, guarded, 2 people maintaining a respectful distance across a shared space. This one had something else in it. Not warmth exactly. Something more like the absence of the particular kind of tension that comes from 2 people who have not yet decided whether to trust each other. That tension had not disappeared, but it had shifted, moved back a few inches, made a little more room. When he finished, he sat for a while turning his empty cup in his hands, looking at the fire through the small window of the stove door. Then he said that tomorrow he would bring more wood in, stack it by the door, so she would not have to go out to the shed in bad weather. She said he did not have to do that. He said he knew. Then, he said, the coffee in the morning. He would wait for it before he went out. She said she always made coffee in the morning. He said he knew. He said he was just saying so she knew. He meant to wait for it. He put his hand on the ladder rung and climbed to the loft. The boards above her head creaked as he settled. Then quiet. Eleanor sat alone at the table. She should have banked the fire and gone to bed. She knew this, but she did not move for a long time, sitting in the diminishing firelight with her hands folded around her empty cup, thinking about a man who expressed care through the grammar of logistics, who said, "I see you by stacking wood at a reachable height and saying he would wait for the coffee," and who had managed, in a single evening, to make her understand that being seen, even in this small and sideways fashion, was something she had been without for long enough that she had stopped noticing its absence, the way you stop noticing a sound that has been missing for years, only perceiving it again when something begins, softly, to make that sound once more. 3 nights later, When the storm had passed and the cold had settled back into its ordinary Montana severity, she woke to a sound from the loft. Not footsteps. Not the creak of the boards that meant he was turning over or getting up. A voice, low and broken, trapped in the particular quality of speech that belongs only to sleep, when the mind's guards are down and the things it has been protecting against get through. She lay still in her narrow bed and listened. The voice came again. Ragged, raw. A name spoken with the weight of something that had been carried for a very long time, and had not gotten lighter with the carrying. Grace. The word hung in the cold dark above her. A woman's name. Spoken the way you speak the name of something you have lost and have not stopped losing. A loss that had not resolved into grief that healed, but into grief that had simply become part of the structure of the person, load-bearing, impossible to remove without taking down the walls. Eleanor did not move. She lay still until the gray light of early morning came through the window, listening to the wind and the settling of the logs in the stove, thinking about the name, about the box in the shadow at the base of the ladder, the dust around it, but not on the lid. About the way he had looked at her mother's tablecloth on the first night, that tightening and releasing along his jaw, as though he had seen something he was not prepared to see and had to spend a moment deciding what to do with the recognition. In the morning, she did not ask. She rose before dawn, the same as every morning. She built the fire. She ground the coffee. She set 2 cups on the table. When he came down, his face was drawn, his eyes carrying the particular hollowness of a man who has been somewhere difficult in the night and has not entirely returned. He sat without speaking. She poured his coffee. Then she poured a second cup and set it beside his plate without comment. He looked at the second cup. He looked at her. She said she figured he might want extra this morning. Cold night. Something moved behind his eyes. Not suspicion, not gratitude exactly. Something that did not have a simple name. He wrapped both hands around the first cup and drank. Neither of them mentioned the name. But that evening, when Eleanor went to the woodshed for the night supply, she found the heavy rounds had been moved, restacked. The largest pieces now sat at chest height, where a person of her height could slide them out without reaching up or bending down. The medium logs below. The kindling in the basket by the door. She stood in the cold of the woodshed and looked at the neat arrangement for a long moment, her breath pluming white in the lantern light. He had not said anything, had not asked if she needed help, had simply looked, understood, and done it. She carried an armful of wood back to the cabin. She did not mention the woodshed. He did not mention it either. But that night at the table, by the fire, after he had gone up to the loft, she sat for a while thinking about the distance between words and actions, and which one a person trusted more when the two offered different information, and which one this man, without meaning to, was teaching her to read. It was the 3rd week of November when she went to Copper Creek for supplies. She had been once before, briefly, with Caleb, 2 days after her arrival, when he needed to collect a package from the post and she needed to understand where the town was in relation to the ranch. That visit had been functional, purposeful, brief. This one she made alone, on the gray mare he told her she could use, and it was on this visit that she met Marta Aldis. Marta Aldis was the wife of the man who ran the general store, a woman of 50-some years whose goodwill was genuine and whose curiosity was considerably more vigorous than her discretion. She welcomed Eleanor with the particular warmth of a woman who is glad to have someone new to talk to, and who has been storing up observations against exactly this occasion. She asked how Eleanor was settling in. She asked if the cabin was warm enough. She asked if Caleb had shown her where the spare blankets were kept, because he had an entire trunk of them up in the loft that his wife had made. God rest her. And he never took them out, but a body could freeze, waiting for him to think of it on his own. Eleanor noted the phrase his wife without showing that she had noted it. Then Marta Aldous said, with the tone of a woman delivering information she has decided you deserve to have, that Eleanor should know that Caleb Holt had sent for a bride once before. October of 1879. The woman had arrived on a Tuesday and was gone by the Saturday of the 6th week. No explanation given to anyone, no letter left that anyone knew of, just her spot at the table empty one morning, and her horse back in the post by noon. Eleanor paid for her flour and her salt and her tin of baking powder. She thanked Marta Aldous for her help. She walked out into the wind. She stood on the wooden boards outside the store and looked down the main street of Copper Creek, which was short enough that she could see both ends of it from where she stood. A woman had come here before her, had stayed 6 weeks, and left without a word. There were reasons a person did the thing that woman had done. There were several of them, but the one that stayed with Eleanor, the one she could not put down as she untied the gray mare and mounted and turned toward the road home, was the simplest one. That the woman had found she could not stay in a space with a person who had decided, without consulting her, that she was not worth the risk of being seen. She was halfway home, the road rising through the pines, the light thin and cold through the branches above her, when she saw them. 2 men on horseback stopped at the edge of Caleb's land, where the fence line met the tree line on the north side of the property. They were not moving through. They were standing, facing the direction of the cabin, which was not visible from where they sat, but was exactly where you would face if you were orienting yourself toward it. Their horses stood square and still with the patience of horses accustomed to their riders, stopping in places and looking at things for no immediately apparent reason. Eleanor did not slow the gray mare. She kept her pace even, her posture unchanged, her eyes forward in the manner of a woman simply traveling a road she had every right to travel. She noted the horses, a bay and a dark roan, and she noted the men, neither of whom she recognized, and she noted that when she came into their line of sight, they did not move away with the haste of people caught doing something they should not have been doing. They moved away with the unhurried confidence of people who had no concern about being seen, because what they were doing was not yet anything they could be called to account for. She rode the rest of the way home without looking back. That evening she told Caleb she had been to town for flour and salt. She told him the post had a package waiting with his name on it, left by someone from Helena 2 weeks prior, and she had brought it back. She set the package on the shelf. She did not tell him about Marta Aldous and the woman who had left in the 6th week. She did not tell him about the 2 riders at the fence line. She was not ready to tell him about either of those things, because telling him about them would require her to also say something about what she knew and how she knew it. And she had not yet decided how much of what she knew she was prepared to lay on the table between them. It was the last week of November, 3 days before a holiday that they did not discuss and did not mark, when he asked her about her handwriting. They were sitting at the table after supper, the fire burning well, the wind outside the kind of sustained wind that made the interior sound of the cabin feel like a particular kind of company. He had a piece of wood in his hands and his knife, working at something she could not yet identify. She was writing a letter, her second to her sister that month, the lamp turned up to give her light enough to write clearly. He said, without looking up from the wood, that he had noticed her handwriting before. He asked where she had learned to write like that. She said a law office. In Columbus? He said what kind of law office? She set her pen down, carefully, at the edge of the paper so it would not roll. She looked at him. He was still working at the wood, not looking at her. But the set of his hands had changed, the way hands change when the attention behind them has shifted from the task to something else. She said Harrington and Sons, land disputes primarily, property claims, railroad contracts. 6 years, from when she was 19 until she married Thomas Marsh, who thought it was not proper for a wife to work, and so she stopped. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The knife moved through the wood in a long, even stroke, taking a thin curl off the surface. He said that was a long time to do that kind of work. She said it was. He did not ask why she had stopped. She did not offer it. But something had shifted in the room, the same way something had shifted the night of the first storm, only quieter, less dramatic, more like a door that had moved a 1/4 inch on its hinges rather than opened. She picked up her pen and continued the letter. He continued with the wood. The fire burned. The wind pressed at the window. After a while he said, not quite to her, not quite to himself, that it was a particular thing, knowing how to read that kind of document. She said it was. He said nothing else. She said nothing else. But that night, lying in her narrow bed in the dark, she thought about the envelope under the coffee tin and the bundle of documents in her valise, and the 2 riders standing at the fence line without concern for being observed. And she thought about all of this the way she thought about a file that was not quite complete. A set of documents that were related but had not yet been fully assembled into the shape of what they were trying to say. She was not afraid. She was something closer to alert. The kind of alert that comes not from threat already arrived, but from the particular quality of a situation that is still assembling itself, still deciding what it intends to become. She thought about the tablecloth on the table, about a man who waited for her to sit before he ate and did not think this required comment. About coffee kept warm 3 times and wood stacked at the right height, and a chair she had not yet noticed was repaired. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind, and above her, through the ceiling of her room and the floor of his loft, she heard nothing. No name spoken in sleep that night. Only the cabin settling around them both, the cold pressing in at the edges, the fire holding against it, 2 people in separate rooms breathing in the same dark, neither entirely alone and neither, yet, entirely willing to say so. The wooden box sat in the shadow at the base of the ladder. The dust had settled around it again. The lid had not been opened. Not yet. The first time she heard him say her full name, she was not prepared for what it did to her. Not Eleanor. Not Mrs. Holt, which was what Marta Aldous called her in town with a brightness that felt like it was auditioning for something. Her name, the whole of it, spoken quietly across a firelit room by a man who rarely spent words on anything that was not strictly necessary, which meant that when he spent them, they carried the full weight of everything he had not said around them. But that came later. Before that, there was December. December came into the mountains the way serious things come, without announcement, simply arriving and making itself at home and expecting to be accommodated. The snow that had been tentative in November became decided in December, settled, committed. The world outside the cabin reduced itself to a smaller and smaller radius of the known and the manageable. The woodshed, the well, the path between them and the cabin door, which Caleb cleared every morning without being asked, and which filled again by afternoon with a patience that the snow seemed to feel no need to apologize for. They moved through the shortened days in the rhythm they had established, which had by now the quality of something worn smooth by repetition. She rose before him, built the fire, made coffee. He came down when the first gray light touched the window, drank his coffee at the window the way he always did, standing with his weight on his left leg, looking toward the eastern ridge. They ate. He went out. She worked the cabin, the cooking and the mending and the quiet management of a household that was slowly, without either of them directing it, becoming something other than a man's shelter and more like a place two people lived. Small things accumulated. He had started leaving his boots just inside the door instead of on the porch, which meant she did not have to sweep the cold in every time he came inside. She had started making a second portion of whatever she cooked that was worth keeping, leaving it in the pot on the back of the stove, covered, so that if he came in late, there was something warm without either of them having to address the fact that she had waited. He had started, she noticed, in the second week of December, refilling the water bucket in the evenings, carrying it in from the well before the temperature dropped to the point where the ground around the well became treacherous. She did not have to haul it in the morning cold. Neither of them mentioned any of this. The small adjustments existed in a register below speech, below acknowledgement, in the same register as the way water finds a course through ground, not deciding, simply moving toward the shape that the terrain allows. It was mid-December when the accident happened. She had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when she heard it. Not a sound from above, not from the loft where Caleb slept. A sound from outside, muffled by distance and snow. A low concussive report that could have been a branch under the weight of ice, could have been a dozen things. But that landed in her sleeping mind with the specific quality of wrongness that pulls a person up through sleep, whether they intend to wake or not. She lay still for a moment, listening. The cabin was quiet. The fire had burned down to coals, casting a dim reddish light. From the loft above, nothing. No creak of boards, no sound of him turning. Then she noticed the cold coming from the door. It was not latched, not swinging open, just not fully closed, the latch not caught. The door resting against the frame with a half-inch gap at the edge that was admitting a thin, cold breath of outside air. She got up. She crossed to the door and opened it and looked out. His tracks in the snow. Clear, fresh, going west toward the fence line and the rocky outcrop at the base of the ridge, where the stone face came close to the trail, and the ground was uneven with roots and half-buried rock that the snow covered and made uniform and therefore treacherous. She did not go back inside for her coat. She grabbed it from the peg and pulled it on while she was already moving, her boots unlaced, her hair loose down her back, because the tracks were fresh and the temperature was the kind of temperature that had instructions in it. She found him a 1/4 mile from the cabin. He was at the base of the rocky outcrop, lying on his side in the snow, his right leg pinned between 2 stones that had come loose from the face above. She could see, even from the distance at which she first saw him, that the way his leg was positioned was not the way a leg was meant to be positioned. And she felt something go cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She came down the slope to him as quickly as the footing allowed. He was conscious, His face was gray, and his lips were darkening toward blue. And when he spoke, her name it came out, cracked and dry, the voice of a man who had been lying in serious cold for longer than he should have been. She told him not to talk. She pressed her fingers to the side of his throat and felt his pulse, thready but present, and she looked at the stones, and she looked at the angle of his leg, and she took stock of what she had, which was herself, in the dark, on a mountainside, with no tools, and no help coming. She braced her shoulder against the larger stone, and pushed. Nothing. She changed her angle, dug the toes of her boots into the snow to find purchase against something that might hold, and pushed again with everything she had until her vision went white at the edges. The stone moved half an inch. Caleb said, through teeth locked against the cold and the pain, again, when she counted. She counted. She drove her shoulder into the stone, and he pulled, and a sound came out of him that she would not think about later if she could help it. Low and broken and completely involuntary, the sound of a person pushed past the point where dignity has any purchase. And then his leg was free, and the stone settled back with a grinding thud, and she sat back on her heels in the snow, breathing in ragged pulls, her arms shaking, her chest burning. She asked if he could stand. He said no. She looked at his leg, at the wrong angle below the knee, visible even through the heavy canvas of his trousers. And she said she was going to have to drag him. And he said nothing, which was agreement. She got behind him, hooked her arms under his, and pulled. A quarter mile. She stopped twice, her lungs raw, her legs threatening to give way beneath her, sweat running down her back despite the cold. Each time she stopped, she gave herself 30 seconds, and then started again because stopping was not a solution to the problem of a man bleeding into his boot in sub-zero temperature a quarter mile from the nearest shelter. By the time she got him through the cabin door, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a gray bleeding into the black, and her legs gave out on the threshold. She knelt there in the doorway with him half across her lap, and the fire burned to almost nothing, and her entire body shaking with the sustained effort of the past hours. She did not allow herself to stay on the floor. She rebuilt the fire with hands that were stiff and clumsy, dropping the kindling twice, willing herself through the steps in sequence, because sequence was the only thing available to her, the only structure she could hold on to when everything else was asking to fall apart. Small sticks, then medium, then a log when the flame caught and held, then another. Then she went back to him. The leg was bad. She had known this before she cut away the trouser leg, and seeing it confirmed what she already knew and added the specific detail of the bone pressing white and insistent against the skin below the knee, not broken through, the skin still intact but fractured, the flesh already beginning to swell and darken with the deep purple that meant bruising going far beneath the surface. She needed a doctor. She had a cabin, a wood pile, and 6 years of watching how the people at Harrington and Sons dealt with situations that were not what they were supposed to be and could not be made into what they were supposed to be and had to be managed with what was actually available. She found straight branches in the wood pile, dry, even-grained, and cut them to length with the small hatchet. She tore the calico Sunday dress into strips, working quickly, not letting herself think about the dress, about the fact that it was the one she had worn on her last decent Sunday in Columbus, about anything except the width of the strips and whether they would hold tension evenly. She bound the splints against his leg with the careful tightness of someone who has no margin for error, talking herself through the logic of it, bone alignment, pressure distribution, the difference between tight enough and too tight. He made sounds while she worked. She did not stop. When it was done, she sat on the floor beside him, with her back against the wall, and let herself shake for a while. She had earned the shaking. She allowed it a brief tenure. And then she gathered herself and got up, because there was still the fire to manage, and the water to heat, and the laudanum she had found in the cabinet on her third day in the cabin, a small brown bottle, nearly full, which told her something about the character of the man who owned it. The weeks that followed were unlike anything that had come before them. Caleb could not stand, could not walk, could barely sit upright without the pain making a ruin of his face. He had to let her do everything: bring him water, bring him food, help him with necessities she will not catalog here, except to say that managing them required a matter-of-factness from her and a surrender from him that cost him more than the pain did. She could see that. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the clipped brevity of his words in those first days, the way a man sounds when he is using language as a container for something that has nowhere else to go. He said he could do it himself. She said he could not. He said to leave him be. She said no. She said this without apology and without softness and without the particular quality of patience that is really condescension dressed in gentler clothes. She said it the way she said everything that was simply true, as a statement of fact that did not require elaboration. And she kept coming back with the broth and the water and the clean bandages and the willow bark tea that she had prepared from the small stock of medicinals in her valise, bitter and effective. And she did not comment on his difficulty with being helped. And she did not make him feel managed. And somewhere in the second week, the sharpness went out of his refusals. And in the third week, he began to say, "Thank you." It was near the end of the third week that she understood something had shifted between them more permanently than anything that had shifted before. She had given him her room, it being the only practical solution to the problem of getting him to a bed he could use without navigating the ladder to the loft, and she had taken the pallet by the fire, close enough to hear him if he needed something in the night. She had been doing this for 3 weeks. She was tired in the sustained, structural way of a person who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that tired is no longer a condition, but simply a fact about the air. She woke in the dark to the sound of him shifting in the bed, not urgently, not the sharp movement of pain arriving suddenly, the slow, restless shift of someone awake and struggling with the lesser version of it, the ache that does not spike but does not leave. She went to him without lighting the lamp. The fire had burned to coals, just enough to see by. He was awake. She knew it before she reached the door, the way a person who is pretending to sleep goes more still when they hear someone coming, which is the opposite of what sleeping does. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She did not ask what he needed. She could see what he needed. He said it hurt. Just that. 2 words from a man who had spent 12 years with no one to say them to, who had lost the language of it along with the habit. The words came out with the difficulty of something that had been stored too long in a space too small and had finally been given a door. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rough and cold at the tips from lying still, and they closed around hers with a grip that was not desperate and not casual, the grip of a person holding on to the fact of another person in the dark, finding it sufficient. She did not speak. Neither did he. The coals glowed red in the stove. Later, much later, she felt her head growing heavy. She did not mean to sleep. She meant to stay awake and keep watch, because that was what the situation required, and she had always done what the situation required. But 3 weeks of the palate and the waking at small sounds had accumulated into something that had its own gravity, and at some point between one breath and the next, she stopped fighting it. When Caleb woke before dawn, she was still in the chair, her head tipped forward, her hair loose around her face, her hand still in his. He looked at her for a long time, at the thinness of her wrists, at the lines that 3 weeks had added to her face. He had lived in this cabin for 12 years, and had told himself the solitude was a form of strength. Lying in the cold red light of the coals with this woman's hand in his, he understood for the first time that he had confused the two. Endurance was not strength. Endurance was simply the absence of an alternative. Strength was something different. Strength looked like a woman dragging a man a quarter mile through snow in the dark. Strength looked like hands that did not let go. He did not let go of her hand until the light came. In the first week of January, a letter arrived. Eleanor had ridden down to Copper Creek for supplies, the first time she had made the trip since Caleb's accident, and Marta Aldous handed it to her across the counter with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. The letter was addressed to Eleanor Marsh Holt, Copper Creek, Montana. The return address was Columbus, Ohio. Harrington and Sons, attorneys at law. She put it in her coat pocket and rode home without opening it, which was more difficult than it sounds, because Eleanor Marsh had spent 6 years of her life being the person in the room who opened the difficult correspondence and understood what it contained. And the habit of confronting rather than postponing was deeply set in her. She opened it that evening, after Caleb had settled for the night, sitting at the table with the lamp turned up full. The stated content was benign. A property matter related to Thomas Marsh's estate required her signature to be formally closed. Standard procedure. Nothing alarming in the language itself. But Eleanor had spent 6 years learning that the language of legal correspondence was exactly that. Language. A surface designed to communicate one thing while the document as a whole communicated another. The surface said estate closure. The structure said something else. Harrington and Sons had found her. They knew her name here, her married name here, which meant they knew she had answered Caleb's advertisement and where she had gone, and that she was now Eleanor Holt of Copper Creek, Montana, the wife of a man who owned land that Northern Pacific Railroad needed. The connection between Harrington and Sons and Northern Pacific Railroad was not a secret to anyone who had spent 6 years at Harrington and Sons. She folded the letter. She put it in the lining of her valise, between the oilcloth bundle and the inner seam, where it lay alongside documents that were beginning to feel less like something she had kept out of professional habit, and more like something she had kept because some part of her had known, even 6 years ago, that there would be a moment when they would be needed. The next evening, sitting by the fire with Caleb across from her, the first time in 3 weeks that he had been well enough to sit in the chair by the stove rather than in the bed, she was aware of him watching her with the quality of attention he brought to things he was trying to understand without asking. He said she seemed far away tonight. She said there was nothing to worry about. He said nothing for a moment. The fire crackled. Then he said quietly, without pressure, without demand, "Eleanor." Just her name. The whole of it. She looked up. He did not say anything else. He was looking at her with dark eyes that were, for the first time in the weeks she had known him, entirely open, not waiting for her to fill a silence, not guarding anything, just looking at her, steadily, The way you look at something you have decided is worth the looking. She said she had received a letter from Columbus. She said it was not immediately dangerous. She said there were some things she needed to think through before she could say more. He nodded once. He went back to the piece of wood he had been working, the knife moving in long, even strokes. She looked at him for a moment, at the set of his shoulders, which were different from when she had arrived, less braced, less prepared for something to go wrong, at his hands on the wood, which were more careful now with the right one than they had been before the accident, the shoulder still stiff from the weeks of limited movement, the grip still rebuilding itself. She had rearranged his woodshed, and he had fixed her chair without a word between them about either. She had sat with him in the dark and held his hand, and he had not let go until morning. She had said no to him when he needed it, and he had, eventually, listened. She thought about the woman who had left in the 6th week. She thought she understood now what that woman had found. Not a bad man. Not an unkind space. Something harder to name and harder to survive. The sealed quality of someone who has decided that the cost of being known is higher than they are willing to pay. A door that was closed so consistently and so quietly that after 6 weeks you could almost convince yourself there was no door. The door was not closed now. It was not open. But it had moved. She picked up her mending. She said, without looking up, that they would need more baking flour before the end of the month. And salt. The barrel was running low. He said he would ride down next week if the weather held. They sat in the quiet of a cabin in December, 2 people and a fire. And the silence between them was full in the way that silences become full when 2 people have stopped trying to protect themselves from each other and have not yet figured out what to do with what that leaves behind. That night, Eleanor sat alone after he had gone up to the loft. She pulled the oilcloth bundle from her valise and set it on the table in front of her and looked at it for a long time without untying the cord. She knew what was in it. 4 case files. 4 families. 4 pieces of land taken by a railroad that had learned the mechanics of legal language well enough to know exactly how to use it and exactly how to abuse it. And that had learned this partly in the offices of a law firm in Columbus, Ohio, where a 20-year-old woman had spent 6 years learning to read documents so carefully that she had eventually read the wrong one and understood something she had not been meant to understand. She had not taken the files because she was planning something. She had taken them because she was the person in that office who could not look at something wrong and pretend she had not seen it, and because taking them was the only action available to her at the time, and because she had carried them for 6 years, not knowing what she was carrying them toward. She looked around the cabin, at the tablecloth on the table, the yellow daisies soft in the lamplight, at the woodshed door just visible through the frost-edged window, at the chair she was sitting in, which was solid and even and had been fixed without ceremony and without expectation of acknowledgement. She untied the cord. She unfolded the oilcloth. She looked at the 4 files, and she thought about the 2 riders at the fence line, and the envelope under the coffee tin, and the letter from Harrington and Sons in the lining of her valise. She thought about the shape of what was coming. She tied the cord. She folded the oilcloth. She put the bundle back in her valise and latched it and set it under the bed where it had been since she arrived. She banked the fire. She turned down the lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and to the quiet from the loft above. And she thought that this was the kind of place that had taken 12 years to break, and that was not going to be taken without a fight. and she thought that she had spent 6 years learning exactly the kind of fight this was going to be, and she thought that she was, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, exactly where she was supposed to be. She closed her eyes. Above her, from the loft, silence. No name spoken in sleep. Just the cabin holding them both in the cold Montana dark. The fire breathing low in the stove. The wind running through the pines outside, like something looking for a way in and not finding one. They came on a Thursday morning, when the light was still thin, and the frost had not yet left the window glass. Eleanor was at the stove when she heard the horses. Not one horse. The sound of Caleb coming back from checking the eastern fence, which she had learned to distinguish by the particular rhythm of a single set of hooves on frozen ground. Multiple horses. 3, she counted, listening without moving, her hand still on the handle of the skillet. Moving at the deliberate pace of people who have not come quickly because they do not need to come quickly, because they are confident in what they are coming to do. She looked through the frost-edged window. 3 riders emerging from the tree line at the western edge of the property. The man in front wore a wool coat that was too fine for this mountain, the fabric city fabric, the cut city cut, a bowler hat that belonged in a hotel lobby in Helena rather than on a trail in February. A gold watch chain caught the thin morning light and threw it back. The 2 men behind him were local, or looked it, working clothes, practical horses, the posture of men hired to be present rather than to think. She looked at Caleb. He was in the chair by the stove, his leg no longer in the splint, but still stiff, still not fully reliable on uneven ground, the cane leaning against the wall within reach. He had heard the horses too. His eyes were on the window, and his hand had gone to his hip, where his knife usually hung, and found nothing because he had set it on the shelf that morning to sharpen the blade and had not yet put it back. His eyes moved to the rifle above the door. The distance between his chair and the door was perhaps 10 feet. He might as well have been looking at the other side of a river. The man in the bowler hat swung down from his horse in the yard. His boots made 2 precise sounds on the frozen ground, the sounds of a man who had rehearsed his entrance, or had made enough of these visits that they had become a kind of performance he no longer had to consciously direct. He walked to the porch steps and stopped. Caleb Holt. His voice was the voice of someone accustomed to rooms where his voice was the one that mattered. My name is Harlan Crane. I represent the Northern Pacific Railroad. I believe you received our correspondence in October. Caleb said he had burned it. Crane smiled at this. The smile did not reach his eyes, which were the color of winter sky, pale and without warmth, doing the real work of the conversation while the smile performed something that resembled pleasantness. He reached into the breast pocket of his fine wool coat and produced a folded document, thick paper, official weight. He held it out and said this was a second copy. He said the territorial government had authorized Northern Pacific Railroad to acquire rights of way for a proposed spur line running through the valley. He said Caleb's property sat in the direct path of the proposed route. He said there were questions about the validity of the original land claim that the railroad, in cooperation with the Territorial Land Office, had a legal obligation to investigate. Caleb said he had deeds. He said they were registered with the county. Crane said county filings were one matter. He said federal registration was another. He said that under the Homestead Act amendments of 1879, any parcel lacking proper federal documentation reverted to public domain, and that the territorial government had both the right and the responsibility to reclaim such parcels for public use. He said all of this pleasantly, informatively, the way a person explains something to someone who cannot be expected to understand it on their own. Then his eyes moved from Caleb to the window, and then to the door, and his smile shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a smile shifts when it has found what it was looking for. Caleb tried to stand. She heard it before she saw it, the particular sound of a body failing to do what the mind directed it to do, the scrape of the chair, the thud of the cane hitting the floor as his hand missed it, and then the impact of knees against boards. She was already moving toward the door. She heard Crane say something, his voice smooth and even and almost kind, suggesting that perhaps Caleb should sit down. Eleanor opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit her the way it always did, immediately and without courtesy, but she did not acknowledge it. She stood in the doorway in her everyday dress, her apron still on from the morning's cooking, flour on the front of it from the biscuits she had made at dawn. Her hair was pinned but loosely. A few strands already escaped around her face. She looked, she suspected, precisely as unremarkable as she needed to look. She looked at Crane, who looked back at her with the particular attention of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation. She said her husband would stand when he was ready. She asked who Crane was and what he wanted. He told her his name. He told her the railroad's business. He told her that these matters were between the railroad and the landowner, and that perhaps she would be more comfortable waiting inside. She said she was quite comfortable where she was. She said she was Eleanor Holt, wife of Caleb Holt, married in Hamilton County, Ohio, in September of last year. She said she had the marriage certificate inside if he wished to see it. Something moved across Crane's face. Not surprise exactly. The calculation of a man who has encountered an obstacle he did not anticipate and is already determining how to route around it. He said that would need to be verified. He said the railroad required documentation of legitimate family ties before any claim of joint ownership could be considered. He said these were simply the requirements of the law. Eleanor came down one step from the porch, not into the yard. One step, just enough to close the distance between their eye levels. She said she understood that the railroad required proof of legitimate family ties. She said she was standing in front of him, which was generally considered sufficient proof of presence. She said she had arrived in September, had managed the household through a serious accident that had incapacitated her husband for the better part of 2 months, and had every intention of remaining. She said that a wife's testimony regarding the continuous habitation and active management of a homestead property was admissible evidence in territorial court, and that she would be prepared to offer it. Crane looked at her for a moment. She could see him deciding something. She could see him deciding, specifically, whether the woman in the flour-dusted apron was the obstacle she appeared to be, or a manageable complication. She watched him make the wrong decision about this, which was the decision she needed him to make. He said the hearing would be held at the courthouse in Copper Creek in 3 weeks. He said that if Caleb could not produce documentation satisfying the territorial requirements, the government had no choice but to proceed with the claim. He looked at Caleb, who was back in his chair by now. Upright, pale, his jaw set with the particular quality of a man holding himself together through the force of pride, because it is the only force currently available to him. He said that the railroad had no wish to cause hardship. He said this with the expression of a man who has found that saying things is not the same as meaning them and has long since stopped confusing the two. Then he turned and walked back to his horse, and the two men behind him turned their horses, and the three of them rode back toward the tree line at the same deliberate pace at which they had arrived. The sound of hooves faded. Eleanor stood on the porch step until the sound was fully gone. Then she went inside. Caleb was at the table. He had managed to get himself there from the chair, which had cost him something she could see in his face. His hands were flat on the table surface, and he was looking at them with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was not anger and not grief, but something that combined elements of both, and added a third thing that was harder to name, something that sat in a man's chest when the thing he has built with his own hands is told to him that it might not be his. She sat down across from him. She put the document Crane had left on the table between them. She looked at the seal. She had thought, when she first saw it through the window, that something about it was wrong. Now she looked at it directly, and she knew exactly what was wrong. She said she needed to tell him something about the document. She said she needed him to listen without saying anything until she had finished. He looked at her. She told him about Harrington and Sons, not the abbreviated version she had offered when he asked about her handwriting, the version that ended with she had worked there 6 years and left when she married. The full version. She told him that in her 5th year at the firm, she had begun to notice patterns in the railroad contract work that did not resolve into anything legitimate the more carefully she looked at them. She told him about 4 families, 4 parcels of land, 4 sets of documents that had looked official and had been official in the way that forgeries are official, which is to say, they had all the surface properties of real documents and none of the legal foundation. She told him she had made copies of the relevant files before she left the firm. She told him she had kept them. She told him they were in her valise. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He said, why had she not told him this before? She said because she had needed to know first. She said she had needed to understand the shape of what was happening before she could be useful to it. She said she had also, and she said this simply and without apology, needed to know whether he was worth the risk of what telling him would require her to do. He said, and now she knew. She looked at him across the table, at the man who had waited for her to sit before he ate and stacked her wood at a reachable height and fixed her chair without saying a word about it, at the man who had held her hand in the dark without being able to ask for it and had not let go until morning. She said now she knew. She got up and went to her room and came back with the oilcloth bundle. She untied the cord, unfolded the cloth, and spread the 4 files on the table. Then she set Crane's document beside them and pointed at the seal. She said that from March of 1875, all federal territorial seals had been changed from blue ink to red ink by administrative order of the Department of the Interior. She said this was documented and recorded and not a matter of interpretation. She said that any clerk who had handled federal documents after 1875 knew this. She said the seal on Crane's document was blue, the wrong color for a document purporting to carry current federal authority, the color of something made to look official by someone counting on no one in a mountain cabin knowing the difference. Caleb looked at it. He looked at the files from her valise, at the seals on those documents, which were also blue, which was correct because those documents were from before 1875. He looked back at Crane's document, which claimed to be from the current territorial administration. He said they had 3 weeks. She said they needed to ride down to Copper Creek tomorrow and send a telegraph to the land office in Helena requesting confirmation of his federal registration by wire. She said they needed to find Orrin Spivey, who had witnessed the original sale in 1870 and whose signature was on the deed. She said she would need to spend the evening reviewing the files to confirm what she remembered about the specific legal argument. Then she said there was something else. She said that Harrington and Sons knew she was here. She said the letter she had received in January was from them, and that while the stated purpose was a routine estate matter, the real purpose was to confirm her location and her connection to this property. She said that if she used the files at the hearing, Harrington would know she had taken them. She said they might pursue legal action against her. She said she would probably not be able to return to Ohio after this. Not that there was anything in Ohio she was returning to, but she wanted him to understand the full shape of what she was proposing before he agreed to it. Caleb said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at the files on the table, at her handwriting on the margins of the copies she had made, the careful notations of a woman trained to document things that mattered. He was looking at the tablecloth beneath the files, the yellow daisies that had been on this table every day since September, that had been the first thing she had put in this cabin, the first mark of herself she had pressed into a space that had been his alone for 12 years. He said she had come a long way to end up in the middle of someone else's fight. She said she did not think of it as someone else's. He was quiet. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the pines at the base of the ridge with its low, continuous sound. Then he said they should find Orrin Spivey first thing in the morning. She nodded. She began organizing the files. The ride to Copper Creek 3 weeks later was the longest 2 hours Eleanor had spent since the night she dragged Caleb down from the mountain. The cold had eased slightly, the particular cruelty of deep February giving way to something that was still cold but had lost its punishing edge. Caleb rode with the cane strapped across his back, not because he needed it on horseback, but because the courthouse floor was uneven and his leg was not yet reliable on uneven ground, and he had accepted in the past 2 months that accepting help was not the same as surrendering to needing it. Orrin Spivey met them at the edge of town. He was 71 years old, his face a map of the years he had spent in this country, and he had received Eleanor's message 2 days prior and had spent the intervening time, he said, looking forward to telling a railroad man exactly where he could file his paperwork. The courthouse was 2 stories of brick on the main street, its windows reflecting the pale sky. Eleanor had been preparing for this room for 20 years without knowing she was preparing for it. 6 years of documents and filings and case reviews. 5 years of silence that had sharpened everything she knew into something harder and more precise. 2 months on a Montana mountain, learning what it meant to fight for something that was actually worth fighting for. She carried the saddlebag to the front of the room and laid the documents on the table in order, the way she had always laid documents in order, by date, by relevance, by the logic of the argument they were together making. The original deed, March 1870, with Orrin Spivey's signature in the witness line. The survey map. The marriage certificate. The telegraph confirmation from Helena, received that morning, confirming federal registration of the Holt property in June of 1873. Crane sat at the opposing table with 2 lawyers from Helena, who had the look of men who charged well for their presence and expected their presence to be sufficient. When Eleanor began presenting the documents, one of them leaned toward Crane and said something in a low voice. Crane's expression did not change. When she reached the seal, She set Crane's document on the judge's bench directly. She explained the 1875 administrative order. She explained the color change. She set the document beside one of the pre-1875 files from her bundle to illustrate the difference. Blue against blue, legitimate against not. And then she set both of them beside the Helena confirmation, red seal, current, real. Crane said the Helena document could be fabricated. Eleanor said it could be, and that the clerk at the Helena land office who had sent it by wire that morning would no doubt be interested to learn that his official correspondence was being characterized as fabrication and that she had included his name and badge number in her request specifically so that he could be contacted for confirmation. Then she said she had one more thing to present. She said that the document Crane had brought to the Holt property in February bore not only the wrong seal color, but a specific embossed stamp that had been retired from use in 1877 when the territorial administration changed its standard forms. She said this information was contained in the administrative records of the Helena Land Office, which she had requested by telegraph along with the registration confirmation. She set the second wire on the judge's bench beside the first. Crane's lawyer put his hand on Crane's arm. Crane did not look at him. The judge, a man named Ira Beckwith, who had the face of someone who had spent 30 years watching people try to outsmart each other in his courtroom and had formed considered opinions about the enterprise, looked at the documents on his bench for a long moment. He looked at Crane. He asked where the document Crane had presented had originated. Crane began to say that the document was prepared by the Territorial Land Office in the standard manner. The sound came from the wall near the door. A man clearing his throat. Not a lawyer. Not anyone who had been called to speak. Whit Dalloway was 26 years old and had the face of someone who had been carrying something heavy for the past 4 months and had decided this morning that he was going to put it down. He was standing with his back against the wall and his hands gripping the back of the bench in front of him, his knuckles white against the wood. He said his name. He said he had been working for Harlan Crane since October. He said that in November, Crane had given him a seal and sent him to the Helena Land Office with instructions to apply it to 3 documents that Crane described as routine administrative filings that had been delayed in processing. He said the clerk on duty had been a man Crane had arranged to be there, a man who had looked the other way while Whit applied the seal to the documents and then initialed them as processed. Crane said this was a disgruntled employee manufacturing a grievance for personal reasons. Whit said he was not manufacturing anything. His voice cracked on the word, but he kept going. He said his father had worked a claim outside Helena in the 1870s. He said his father had received documents from the railroad that looked like the documents he had applied the seal to. He said his father had spent 3 years fighting a claim he could not win because the documents were in order, or appeared to be in order. And by the time anyone looked closely enough to see that they were not, the legal costs had consumed everything his father had. He said his father had died in the spring of 1881 and had never gotten his land back. He said he had taken Crane's money because he had 3 children and the work had paid better than anything else available to him in October. He said he had told himself it was administrative work, routine work, that what he was doing was not the same as what had been done to his father. He said he had been wrong about that, and he was saying so now. The courtroom was loud for a moment. Judge Beckwith brought his gavel down twice, sharp and definitive, and the noise subsided. Beckwith looked at Crane for a long time. Crane was looking at the documents on the table in front of him with the expression of a man watching the ground he has been standing on change its fundamental nature. Beckwith said he was ordering a full investigation into the railroad's filing practices in the territory. He said all pending land claims associated with Northern Pacific Railroad were suspended pending the outcome of that investigation. He said that Caleb Holt's ownership of his property was affirmed by the court and that any further attempts to contest that ownership through the Territorial Land Office would be treated as contempt of the investigation. He brought the gavel down once more. Crane gathered his papers. His lawyers gathered their cases. None of them looked at Eleanor or at Caleb or at Whit Dalloway, who was still standing by the wall, his hands no longer white on the bench back, hanging at his sides now, a man who had set something down and was learning what his hands felt like without the weight. Crane walked toward the door. He was 3 steps from it when he stopped. He turned and looked at Eleanor. Only Eleanor. He said that Harrington and Sons would receive a full account of the proceedings. He said they would be very interested to learn the provenance of the documents she had presented. He said that a woman who removed confidential files from a law firm's records was not a woman whose testimony would be difficult to impeach in a civil proceeding. Eleanor looked at him across the room. She said she expected Harrington would find the proceedings interesting. She said she also expected that the partners of Harrington and Sons would find it interesting when the Helena investigation subpoenaed the railroad's legal correspondence from the past 8 years, which would include retainer agreements, billing records, and the case files associated with 4 land acquisitions in the territory between 1875 and 1880. She said that subpoenas of that nature tended to surface details that firms like Harrington preferred to keep in the filing cabinet. She said she had spent 6 years in that filing cabinet and knew exactly what details were there. Crane stood in the doorway. He said nothing. He walked out. They rode home in the long afternoon light, the sun dropping toward the western ridge, the snow on the upper peaks catching the last of it and throwing it back in shades of gold and rose. Caleb rode without the stiff posture he had held all the way down, the braced quality of a man preparing for something. He rode the way he rode the trail he knew, the trail home. After a while, he said she had known about Harrington before she ever wrote to him. She said she had not known specifically. She had known about the railroad and about the pattern. She had not known his name or his land until she read his advertisement. He asked if she would have answered the advertisement if she had not known what she knew. She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved through the pines, their breath clouding in the cold air. She said she did not know. She said she thought she would have, because the advertisement said not needed, sentiment, and she had been in a position where that phrase felt like the most honest thing she had read in 5 years. She said the rest of it, the knowing, the files, all of that, she thought, was something she had been carrying toward a purpose she did not understand until she arrived and found what she had arrived at. He said, that sounded like something a person said when they did not want to admit they had a plan. She said it sounded that way to her too, and that she was not certain the distinction mattered. He was quiet for a while. The trail rose through the last stretch of pines before the clearing where the cabin came into view. He said there was something he should have said before. He said he should have asked her more directly what she knew and what she was carrying. And he had not asked because he had been, for a long time, a man who did not ask questions he was not prepared to hear the answers to. And he was telling her this now because he thought she deserved to know that the not asking was not because he did not want to know. It was because he was afraid of what knowing would require him to do with it. She looked at him. at the profile of a man who had spent 12 years making himself smaller and more manageable until small and manageable had become the whole shape of his life, and who was doing right now the uncomfortable and necessary work of making himself larger again. She said she understood that. He said he thought she probably did. The cabin came into view at the edge of the clearing, the smoke from the stove she had banked before they left still trailing from the chimney in a thin line against the pale sky. Home, she thought, and then thought about the word, about what it meant and what it had meant before, and what the difference was between a place you lived and a place you had built yourself into, one small act of presence at a time. They rode the last distance without speaking. The horses knew the way. At the edge of the porch, before she dismounted, she saw it. A single envelope on the bottom step, held down by a stone against the wind. The handwriting on the front was her sister's. She dismounted and picked it up. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Caleb, who was watching her from his horse. She said it was from her sister in Dayton. She opened it and read it, standing in the cold. The horses breathing around her, the late afternoon light going gold across the snow. Her sister wrote that she was well. She wrote about the winter in Dayton. She wrote that she was thinking of coming west in the spring, in May perhaps, to see the country and to see Eleanor, and that she hoped the invitation would be welcome. Eleanor folded the letter. She looked at the cabin, at the one window with its new curtains, white cotton with a blue border, at the door she had walked through every day since September, at the porch with its two chairs that had been sat in separately for 7 months, and together only once. She looked at Caleb. She said her sister wanted to come in May. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Eleanor. He said that they would need to put a proper bed in the back room. She said they would. He dismounted. She took the horses to the post. They went inside together, and the cabin was warm from the morning fire, and the tablecloth was on the table where it always was, and something that had been waiting a long time to be over was over, and something that had no name yet was standing in its place, uncertain and new, and asking quietly to be allowed to begin. The creak came back first. Eleanor heard it before she saw it, lying in the gray of early morning with the particular quality of wakefulness that comes in spring, when the body has been cold for long enough that the first softening of the air reaches it before the mind is fully conscious. Not the tentative drip of snowmelt from the eaves that had been the sound of February giving way to March. Something deeper, more committed. The creak below the cabin finding its voice after 4 months of silence. Water moving over stone the way it had been moving over stone in that valley for longer than anyone alive could account for. She lay still and listened to it. Then she smelled coffee. She came out of her room to find Caleb at the stove. He did not turn around when she appeared in the doorway. He was standing with his weight distributed more evenly between both legs than he had managed in months, the cane leaning against the wall rather than in his hand, which meant either that his leg was better this morning or that he was not going to let it be otherwise. She suspected both were true. He said, without turning, not to say anything about the eggs. She looked at the pan. The eggs were slightly more liquid than they should have been. The bacon at the edges had gone past crisp into something more decisive. She sat down at the table and said nothing about the eggs. They ate the first breakfast he had cooked in the 7 months she had been there. The bacon was firm where it was not burnt. The eggs were warm and the coffee was good, which was the important thing, and the tablecloth lay between them with its yellow daisies, which had been on this table through every meal of those 7 months, which had been there the first night when she spread it across rough pine in a cold cabin, and he had stopped moving at the stove and said nothing, which would be here, she understood now, for a long time after this particular morning. They sat down at the same moment. Neither of them had to wait. After breakfast, Caleb said he was going up to check the fence line on the western slope. He picked up his coat from the left peg, the way he always did, and then he looked at the cane leaning against the wall for a moment. He left it there. He went out. Eleanor stood at the window and watched him cross the yard and start up the slope, his stride uneven still, the right leg not quite matching the left, but moving with the intention of a man who expects to come back. She watched until the pines took him, and then she turned back to the table. She washed the dishes. She swept the floor. She went out to the kitchen garden plot she had been preparing since the first week of March, when the top inch of ground had softened enough to turn, and she worked the soil with the fork, loosening the winter's compaction, checking the depth of the thaw. The ground was ready. She had seeds from the general store in Copper Creek, obtained on the last supply trip, stored through the remaining cold in the cool corner of the lean-to. Onion sets, carrot seed, a paper envelope of bean seed that Marta Aldis had pressed on her with the authority of a woman who has grown beans in this elevation for 30 years and knows things about the subject that are not in any book. She worked until the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge and the morning light had gone from gray to gold. She could hear the creek from here. She could hear, from somewhere in the pines above the cabin, the first bird that had been back long enough to feel proprietary about its territory. She straightened up and looked at the valley below. The change that had been happening gradually, incrementally, 1 degree of temperature at a time, was suddenly visible as a whole. The white that had been total and absolute in January, that had reduced the world to the distance between the cabin and the woodshed, had pulled back to the highest ground, the upper ridges and north-facing slopes where the sun arrived last and left first. Everywhere else the ground was brown and soft, and in the lower meadow, beginning to show the first tentative green of grass finding its way back to the surface. Spring in Montana was not the gentle negotiation of spring in Ohio. It arrived like something that had been waiting at the door and finally lost its patience. She was back in the cabin, washing the dirt from her hands, when she heard his boots on the porch. She heard him stop at the door for a moment, the pause she had come to recognize, not the functional pause of a man removing muddy boots. Something slightly longer than that. A pause that had been getting shorter over the months but had not quite disappeared. The pause of a man who grew up alone in this space and was still, at some level, registering the fact that it was no longer only his. He came in. He said the western posts were holding. He said the ground was soft enough now that he could reset the 2 that had been working loose since fall, that it would be better to do it before the full thaw made the footing unreliable. She said she would make lunch before he went back out. He said there was something he wanted to show her first. He said it could wait for lunch if she was busy. She dried her hands and looked at him. He was standing just inside the door, not quite at ease, with the look of a man who has decided to do something that required a decision. She said she was not busy. He said to come outside then. They went out to the porch. He gestured toward the 2 chairs, the ones that had been there since before she arrived, the ones she had looked at all winter and understood as the furniture of a man who had no one to sit with. She sat down. He lowered himself into the other, moving with the careful deliberateness his legs still required, and set his hands on the arms of the chair and looked out at the valley. The light was the light of a Montana afternoon in early April, clear and long, the kind of light that makes distances look possible. The peaks to the west still held their snow. Below, the creek was a silver line through the new green of the lower meadow. A hawk was working the thermals above the far tree line, patient and unhurried, its shadow moving across the slope below it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man withholding something. The silence of a man finding the right place to set something down. He said, 12 years. She did not answer. She watched the hawk. He said he had sat out here for 12 years and told himself it was enough. A man with land and a roof and work that needed doing. He said he had made the argument to himself often enough that he had stopped hearing it as an argument and started hearing it as a fact, the way you stop hearing a sound that has been there long enough. He said he had been wrong about that. He reached into the pocket of his coat. He held out his hand. The carving sat in his palm, small enough that his fingers had been curved around it to carry it without damage. A bird. She had seen him working on something for weeks, in the evenings by the fire, the small knife moving through the wood in the focused way he brought to the things he made. But he had always angled it away from her when she looked, and she had let him keep the privacy of it. She looked at it now. A mountain bluebird, the wings spread slightly as though caught between the decision to stay and the decision to lift. The feathers on the wings were individual, each one suggested rather than fully rendered, which was harder to do than full rendering, and showed more clearly what the hands understood about the thing they were making. The beak was slightly open. It was the posture of a bird that had just arrived somewhere and was deciding whether to trust the place it had landed. She took it from his hand. It was warm from his pocket. She turned it over and felt the smoothness of the wood. Worn to this smoothness, not by finishing, but by handling, by the hours his hands had spent on it. He said he did not have a ring. He said he had one, once, and he had buried it with grace, and that was where it should stay. And he was not asking her to stand in any space that had already been filled. He said he was asking her to stand in her own space. He said he was asking her to stay. Eleanor held the bird. She looked at the valley and at the hawk still working the thermals and at the creek catching the light below. She thought about a train platform in Columbus in August, a woman burning a letter she had never sent, a valise with a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth that she had carried 1,400 miles toward a purpose she had not understood until she arrived at it. She thought about coffee kept warm 3 times, a woodshed reorganized without comment, a chair leg fixed in the night, a hand held in the dark by a man who could not ask for the holding and had held on anyway. She said she had been staying since the first night. She said when she kept the coffee warm the 3rd time, standing in that cabin listening to the wind and not knowing if he was coming back and choosing to believe that he was, she had already been staying then. She heard his breath change. A small sound, barely audible, the sound of something that has been held against the possibility of this moment and is, with some difficulty, releasing. She reached over and put her hand on his. His fingers were rough, calloused, warm from the April sun. They closed around hers with the steadiness of someone who has learned, at considerable cost, the difference between holding on out of fear and holding on out of choice. They sat there as the afternoon moved through its long arc. The hawk descended into the tree line. The creek ran below. The snow on the upper peaks caught the changing light and moved through gold, into rose, into the deep blue of evening. When the cold began to come down from the ridge, they went inside. Eleanor built the fire while Caleb lit the lamp. The cabin filled with the warm, uneven light that she had come to know in all its variations, the way it moved across the walls in the mornings and fell straight and steady from the lamp at the table in the evenings and turned the yellow daisies on the tablecloth into something that looked, in certain moments, like the thing her mother had intended when she stitched them. Caleb went to the base of the ladder. He reached into the shadow at the corner where the ladder met the floor. He carried the wooden box to the table and set it down. She had not seen him touch it since the night she had heard him sitting beside it in the dark months ago. The night she had lain still in her room and listened to a man keeping company with something he could not yet open. He sat down. He looked at the box for a moment. Then he looked at her. He said he did not want to open it alone. She sat down across from him, the tablecloth between them, the lamp steady, the fire settling into its even rhythm. He opened the box, the photograph first. A young woman's face, serious and pretty in the way of someone who does not know they are pretty. The brass frame tarnished at the edges, the glass cracked across one corner, a crack that must have happened long ago, that had been there so long it had become part of the image. The ring. Thin gold, worn smooth. A ring bought by a man who did not have much and wanted to give everything. Eleanor looked at it and did not look away, because looking away would have been a form of dishonesty, and she had not come this far to be dishonest about the shape of what was here. Then the letter. The paper had gone the color of old honey. The folds had worn through at the creases, held together by proximity rather than integrity. It had been folded and unfolded enough that the paper knew the shape and returned to it even when laid flat. And then left folded, Eleanor understood, for 12 years, the folding becoming a kind of preservation, a way of keeping the thing without having to read it. Caleb held it for a moment. Then he held it out to her. She unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that has been waiting a long time, aware that the waiting is part of what you are handling. The handwriting was small and uneven, the writing of someone whose hands were not steady when the words were set down. Not many words, half a page. She read them aloud. Grace had written that if he was reading this, he had survived. She wrote that she did not want him to live as a memorial. She wrote that she wanted him to let someone sit beside him at the fire. She wrote that she wanted him to stop being alone. She wrote that she loved him and that love, the kind she meant, did not require the loved person to remain in place forever, did not require the living to stay inside what was gone. She wrote, "Let yourself have what comes next." Eleanor set the letter down. She set it gently, with both hands, the way you set down something that deserves to be set down with care. Caleb sat very still. His eyes were bright in the lamplight, not with the suppressed brightness of a man refusing to show what he felt, but with the open brightness of a man who has stopped refusing. He did not look away. He sat with what he felt and let it be present in the room. After a long time, he reached out and covered the letter with his hand, not closing it away, simply resting his hand on it, the way you rest a hand on the shoulder of something that has been waiting patiently. Eleanor reached across the table and put her hand over his. They sat like that while the fire settled and the lamp burned steady and the creek ran below the cabin in the dark, finding its way through the valley the way water finds its way, Not forcing, not resisting, simply moving in the direction that the ground allows, patient and continuous and certain that it will arrive where it is going. Outside, the spring wind came down from the high places, carrying the cold of snow it had crossed and the green smell of the ground it had warmed on its way down, and it moved through the pines around the cabin and went on down the valley, and the cabin held against it the way it had been holding against the wind for 12 years, solid and patient, and, tonight, not empty. Tomorrow there would be fence posts to reset and a garden to plant and a room to prepare for a sister arriving in May. There would be work, the long, ordinary, necessary work of a place that was alive and intended to stay that way. But tonight there was just this: 2 people at a table. A letter read at last. A hand held in the light instead of the dark. The bluebird sat on the windowsill where Eleanor had placed it that afternoon, its wings spread slightly, its beak open, caught in the moment of deciding to trust the place it had landed. Outside, the real ones would be coming soon. First sign of spring in this country, Caleb had told her once, matter of fact, not looking up from what he was doing. She had kept it the way she kept everything that mattered. Not in a drawer or on a shelf, but somewhere closer than that, in the part of her that had been paying attention since the beginning. Soon, she thought, soon they would come.